Inventory. We all know how important it is for financial statement audits, but in the cybersecurity landscape, particularly with compliance assessments, well, inventory may also make a lot of sense. And even more important is effectively managing your inventory as it pertains to security, compliance, and overall good sound cybersecurity controls. So in today's installment of the Truth Series, I'm joined with a very special friend and colleague, Todd Busswitz, that not only is a manager in our PCI practice, but knows quite a thing or two about inventory and some of the pitfalls to avoid and the strategies to put in place. Hey, Todd, how are you doing today?
I am doing excellent, Ryan.
Excellent,
Glad to
excellent.
be here.
That's great. That's great to know. So I wanted to reach out to you. There's been some discussion in the marketplace about various compliance assessments. Obviously, right now, AI, artificial intelligence, is really sort of emerging as the king of the hill or the thing to pay attention to. But when I was having conversations with you, you were reflecting upon some of the more fundamental aspects of compliance assessments, particularly as it pertains to inventory and inventory management and how it's so important for successful compliance assessments. So I wanted to bring you on. Thanks so much for coming on today and talk to us a little bit about inventory. I'm a financial accountant. You're a financial accountant. We're both CPAs. So inventory means a certain thing in a financial audit context. But in the context of compliance, what do you mean by inventory and why is it so important?
One of the biggest things that people need to understand is exactly what they have in their environment for their devices. We're talking how many different servers you have, how many different firewalls and routers and switches, and all of those electronic devices that are connected to your environment and the in-scope environment for your assessments. If you don't know what you have, it's hard to know how to track it, what to do with it, when to replace it. Um, and it really makes your job difficult. And when it comes to the assessment, it really can tend to add a lot of length and time to the assessment unnecessarily. As far as those devices in your inventory are concerned, you're going to want to know what the purpose of that device is. You're going to want to know what their IP addresses are, what their current versions are, when the end of life for that system is, or end of support, even more importantly, so you know whether or not you have to get the extended support for those devices to keep them in your environment. And then even more important than that is you want to be able to plan for future resources, because the budget guys, they're not the easiest to get money from sometimes. So the longer your runway on planning, the easier it is to get replacing those devices in your inventory. When it comes time for replacing those, it's a lot more straightforward because they've already got the funding approved and they've been planning on it for a while.
That sounds great. And just so that the folks that are listening in will have a great understanding of what we're talking about, when you're talking about these various devices, whether they're network devices, IoT devices, various appliances in your infrastructure, you're not thinking of it in terms of inventory on the shelf. You're actually talking about an inventory of the assets that are actually in use, actually connected, actually performing, controls or transaction processing or storage or those sorts of things, right? This isn't inventory for the sake of knowing what you have as much as it is an inventory as it pertains to how they are being applied and implemented and used in your infrastructure, correct?
Yeah, that's a great clarification there, Ryan. That's exactly what we're talking about. There is still that 5% need to know what you have on the shelf so that if it's ever there for an emergency, that it's still not end of support, end of life. You want to make sure your
Ah,
POI, POS devices are still current and things like that, and your workstations that they're current, have all their patching. You still want to keep track of those, but they're not necessarily considered in scope for most assessments. But it's still a good business practice to know what you have, whether it's in production, which is the most important by far, but also that those few devices that you do have in case of emergency and you needed to use them.
so now I want to build upon that. And with respect to cybersecurity compliance and cybersecurity, what purpose does inventory management and maintenance play? Specifically, if you give me for an example with PCI, when you're looking at and I won't pretend to be the PCI expert here, but the CDE, that's the cardholder data environment, right?
Correct. That's what we also refer to as the in-scope environment.
Got it. And so for that in-scope environment, why does inventory management and inventory maintenance matter so much using the cardholder data environment just as an example for PCI compliance?
Well, you have to know what you have so you can protect it according to whatever standard you're being measured against. In PCI, you want to know that that cardholder data environment is the most important environment. And that's what the whole assessment is based around. But there's also the connected to or could impact the security of
Mm,
devices as well that are included in that scope. But you have to protect them with firewalls and anti-malware and IDS, IPS. Those are things that you can do to harden your environment and help protect those devices. You also have to worry about the configurations for those devices. You don't want just the default configurations. You don't want your default passwords. You want to make sure you're upgrading or updating all of those passwords. Um, you want to make sure you control the access to those devices to only those people who need
mm.
access to it. You don't want unfettered access for everybody into everything, because that can just lead to all kinds of problems, especially if there's a nefarious actor in the or somebody that's disgruntled that would like to get even with the company, which has happened numerous times. You also have turnover. I've
Hmm.
had plenty of clients that have had people that have left the company that were responsible for their inventory. And then when it came time for the assessment, they didn't have a clue where to go to even find what they had. So without a good understanding company at the senior levels of what you have and a plan to manage that, it can really become an issue. And then the other one is mergers. You're going to get new people, new environments, new systems brought into the fold. And without a good inventory, it's hard to know where your stuff ends and their stuff begins. And then, especially when you start blending those together, it can become a real headache.
Understood. There are a couple things that you mentioned there that really piqued my interest. And one of them has to do with access control. And now you're starting to speak in terms of the actual application of security practices, the application of these various technical and even administrative safeguards. And it's a real important aspect to this because on the one hand, if you're not paying attention, you would think that a conversation about inventory is about the device itself and understanding, where the device sits and perhaps what the device does. But a different texture, an additional aspect to this, what you're describing is, well, that can also be a vector for unauthorized access. It could be a vector for potentially allowing a compromise from an unauthorized actor, some malware, or even create risks with respect to the availability of the system. And so understanding what you have, which is what you described, is only part and parcel of the overall cybersecurity and compliance landscape. It's also, now that you understand what you have and where it sits and what it does, you can then better manage risk because you have an understanding of the purpose that it serves and what security controls need to be applied to bring that risk to an acceptably low level. So it's really a conversation about inventory is in fact a conversation about risk management and security. And with the example that you gave about compliance as well. So that's very cool. So Todd, you've been doing a number of these cybersecurity and compliance assessments, and beyond PCI, where have you seen it go wrong? Why is inventory management so important? And what are maybe some common pitfalls that the folks should avoid?
One thing, if you don't have a very good inventory, the assessments become a real puzzle because you're trying to put things together from a bunch of different places. And we've had many assessments that have been delayed because of the time it takes to get the initial list or inventory of all the different devices that are in scope for the assessment, or we get it piecemeal. And
Hmm.
it takes us a while to make the sample selections, which doesn't allow the client's team a lot of time to actually be able to gather that evidence. And then another problem is we've had inventories that are not accurate. And when I've had to resample
Hmm.
inventories at least 8 times, 8 different versions of our sample selections, because there were decommissioned devices in there. There were end of life devices in there that they haven't used. They just didn't take them out. Another pitfall that we find is that, oh, there are end of life and end of support devices in their inventory, which creates a whole nother problem. Because when we bring that to their attention, now those items have to be addressed before we can complete the assessment. So that adds a whole new level of complexity to it. Missing patches. Just because you have a scanner scanning your devices doesn't mean it's catching that. If it's past an end of life or end of support, there are many vulnerability scanners that look for current patches. Well, it has all the current patches. There just aren't any new patches.
I see.
So that's something to just be aware of. The devices, if you don't have an accurate list, they might not be included in your scans. So, I mean, you have to input everything and connect it to the scanner, right? And then by the time you go through and you scan everything thinking, great. Well, then you look and it's like, oh, well, we don't have these devices. We don't have these devices in there. And we didn't know this device was part of the systems that we needed to have scanned, so we weren't scanning it. And that's another thing where you get that turnover in new people that don't truly understand their environment. And if everything is stovepipe, it makes it really hard to keep everything together, to have one person have an understanding of everything when there's no real connection between them. And that's kind of where PCI is going, is to try to improve that and make that more of a process that happens and something that their clients are actually doing on a proactive basis rather than just doing it whenever the assessors come by.
That makes a lot of sense, and particularly with proactivity. We find that being proactive just about anything, is going to make a whole lot of sense, whether you have to catch the bus or if you need to, pack a lunch for the day, or in the case of compliance, making sure that you have an understanding of your inventory and what its needs are. You mentioned patching. I also wanted to talk a little bit about PCI and the PCI compliance and what matters there with respect to inventory management.
In PCI, you have to keep all of your devices up to date. So all of the different operating systems need to be patched. Whenever there's a security vulnerability that's coming out there or a weakness that's been noted, the vendors will all send out their patches. And in the case of PCI, any critical patches need to be applied in that first 30 days, critical and high vulnerability type. They need to be done right away. Anything that's medium or low can take a little bit of time, depending on what your company's change management practices are, vulnerability management practices are. If you say all vulnerabilities need to be remediated within 30 days, then it doesn't matter what it is. They're all done in 30 days. If there's a little bit of justification that can support a longer time frame, then whatever your company's risk assessment that supports that is, that's great. Just take that time. But the big thing is those critical findings, because those are things that are out there now, and the nefarious actors all know about them. And those are patches to fix that and to keep your environment safe.
And does an inventory management system tell you patch? Does it help your patch management process with respect to being able to identify exactly whether or not, you mentioned before, servers that are end of life or past end of life, right? And then the patches that are available. Do you find that typically the most effective inventory management systems and software provide that information to managers in an organization?
What happens with a good, effective inventory management system is that you're always up to date with where your systems are. You have contact with your vendors. You're watching for those patches. You're watching the CISA sites and the other RSS feeds that you get that show or talk about vulnerabilities, and you're always planning. So it's a proactive approach that you're looking for there. And then there are many tools. I mean, you can do it manually. If you have a smaller company, you can do it manually, and you could probably track it in a spreadsheet if you've got less than 50 devices or less than 100 devices if you have a motivated person, and then have them working with somebody so it's shared knowledge, not all stuck with one person. That would probably work fine for some companies. If you have more than that, there's automated systems out there. There are scanning tools that scan your network that look for everything that's there. The problem is those things don't find the things in the cloud. When you're in the cloud, your cloud service providers will do a great job in tracking the inventories there. You know exactly what you have. The big things to worry about there are your baseline or your golden images. That's what you really want to keep track of, because the instances are constantly changing. You also want to keep track of your functions, what functions you have up in the cloud. And if you don't need something, take it out of the system. You don't need to have it there.
That's interesting. And so it's almost an opportunity with an effective inventory management system is for you to really right size your environment for cybersecurity risk management, where if there are things that were there that may have made sense 3, 5, 7 years ago or more, but they're no longer being used and in fact have been decommissioned, well, why not remove those? Why not get those things out of the environment, out of the in-scope environment? Because with PCI, you mentioned is not only the assets themselves, but there's also this contemplation of things that are attached to it. And so if you've got things that are attached that are either non-compliant or end of life or unpatched or what have you, it just seems to just add more risk unnecessarily. But give me the so what here. Let's say that you have a very rudimentary inventory management system. You mentioned like an Excel spreadsheet. So let's say there's an organization, they've got 500, 800, perhaps because they don't know, they've got 500 or 600, let's say, assets, and they're trying to manage all that with an inventory system that's effectively just an Excel spreadsheet. And you mentioned before that for the auditors, for the assessment team, being able to ensure that we have an accurate and complete population to select samples from, request evidence, there's a lot of time and energy invested not only for the assessment team, but also for the organization. And so beyond the fact that it can be very inefficient through poor sampling or poor testing, you're also talking a bit more about you could actually be in a state of non-compliance. Can you bottom line it for us and really talk to us about, well, what really matters with respect to the inventory management system? Because it isn't whether or not it's in a Excel spreadsheet or whether or not it's in one of the more fancy software packages. At the end of the day, who cares if the auditors have to sample and resample? What really goes wrong in an organization, and why does an effective inventory management system matter so much in the context of compliance?
When it comes to managing your systems and having that inventory management for your devices, you really have a lot of risk out there. So you're managing your risk. You have different places that nefarious actors can try to attempt to gain access into your environment. You need to know those things. There's financial risk that way. There's also financial risk that you have a bunch of devices in your inventory that you don't need. So now you're paying for licenses, you're paying for scanning, you have a lot of extra cost that comes in there. So you have the cost that comes to being breached, which is sometimes hard to recover from.
That's right.
If you don't know what you have, you can't protect it.
That's right.
You have the cost of extra licenses, and then you have the emergency cost of changes once you figure out that those devices are now no longer in compliance. You have that, we might have legal issues now because we're contracted to be PCI compliant, for example, or HIPAA compliant. And now we're not in compliance like we said we promised we would be. So there's that risk. Then there's the financial risk of now I got to go out and buy things immediately. And in the supply and demand thing, it's not always easy to get that funding.
That's right.
So there's resources that are taken from other avenues within the company. So, I mean, there's a cascading effect if you don't have a proactive business as usual type approach to managing your inventory. Somebody should always know what systems you have, what they're being used for, where they're at, what their operating systems are. That should be in a plan somewhere that somebody knows, or a few people know what all those devices are, not just the auditors or the assessors in my case. It's important for everybody to know.
That's a really good answer, Todd. I really love that, and I appreciate that. Talk to us a little bit about just sort of the day-to-day, the business as usual, if you would, and how the inventory management is not only going to matter to senior management with some of the risks that you just described, but also for the folks that are touching the keyboard, actively managing these devices. Give us an understanding of why inventory management is so important from a day-to-day business as usual standpoint.
We kind of touched on that a little bit about making your assessments go a lot smoother. But in the case of PCI, that's actually how the standard changed. It's changed so that it's now become more of a business as usual practice. For example, in requirement 12.5 in version 3, the old version, the 3.2.1 version, all they had was people responsible for different things within different incident response and things like that. That was the old 12.5. Well, they revamped it to being able to now measure our customers on their business as usual practices as far as inventory is concerned, and also as far as understanding their scope. Because now it's required that you do an annual, for everyone, an annual scope validation exercise that's documented. That was kind of always assumed that people knew their environment. Well, in the old version, people didn't always know their environment, and there was a lot of educating of what their environment is and discussions about what's in scope and what isn't in scope. Well, now service providers have to do that twice a year, and merchants once a year until 2025, March 31st, when they'll have to do it twice a year as well.
That's called the scope validation. Now, is that a prescribed methodology? When you consider various cybersecurity compliance assessments that are out there, you have on one end, perhaps a lot of the SOC reporting that offers a lot of flexibility for service providers and organizations to develop your controls and implement their risk management practices. And then along that continuum, you're going to have, on the federal side, very prescriptive, it must be. And then somewhere in between, you've got PCI. And so when you describe this scope validation, would you characterize that as a templated methodology or approach? Or are service providers or organizations, do they still have the flexibility to determine how their scope validation efforts are to be planned and performed? Or is that prescriptive in the sense that the standard of the council prescribes or mandates that the scope validation must be done in a particular way by particular people in a particular format?
What it really boils down to is, as PCI assessors, we are validating your scope. So you have to understand your scope. So you're telling us what your scope is, and we're confirming it. What the scoping validation exercises are doing, there's no predefined way to do it. Each company can do it in the way that makes sense for them and that they get the most value out of. What they did with the version 4.0 in PCI is they made PCI more of a business as usual practice. They want you to think about it throughout the year and have it be incorporated in your daily practices and procedures.
That's right.
For example, the inventory control now is that you keep and maintain an inventory and that it is accurate and current.
I see. So
that means you have to update it whenever there's a change and keep it as up to date as possible. Now, they didn't go to say immediately update it and it has to be 100% accurate or anything like that. Those things are kind of assumed.
That's right.
Or wished for anyway. But that's where they're going, is they want you to think about PCI more than once every year when your assessor rolls around for your PCI assessment. They want you to think about this stuff throughout the year. And that scoping validation includes the inventory, but it also includes you talking about another inventory, which is all of your systems or procedures, I should say, that are in place or in scope for the environment, meaning refunds. That's one thing. Any moto sales, making sure you understand your mobile order or telephone order process, sales process, and how that's collected. So you understand all of your payment channels. You understand where cardholder data could possibly be stored.
That's right.
Such as primary account numbers. That's the big thing we're looking for, is credit card numbers and then the CVV numbers. We need to know where those places are stored. As a client, you need to know that, again, so you know what to protect and how to protect it.
That is a very interesting point, because oftentimes when you're having conversations going into an organization, performing the assessment, you start to ask some of those very basic fundamental questions like, where is your XYZ data kept? Where is it stored? And oftentimes inventory management, people are thinking about physical hardware devices that they put, in this particular network segment or that particular network segment. Oftentimes these are appliances that have some sort of a power cord or that's the mindset that oftentimes that we have to encounter. But one of the important aspects of it is there's a data component to this where, sure, there's going to be a physical device somewhere, whether you own it or your cloud provider owns it. But as important, and in some cases, depending on the compliance assessment, more important is the data that resides, is transmitted, or is stored on it. Well, that brings a whole level of additional sensitivity and risk management to this. And so I think is a very important point that you just made there is that whether it's the CVV data, the card data itself, where that sits and where it resides, effective inventory management goes a long way to answer some of those most basic and fundamental questions, like where is it? Oftentimes I've seen them sort of scratch their head and say, well, we think it's here. And in other cases, they'll produce a relatively intricate document which says, here, this is our process flow and this is where the data traverses. And then you try to reconcile or match that up against what their inventory management system is saying, and things aren't absolutely aligned as one might expect. So again, it's breaking news for the auditors, it's breaking news for management, and breaking news is definitely not something that is ever welcomed in a compliance assessment. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I've got a tough question here for you though, Todd, and I don't want to. It depends. I'm looking for you to give us a recommendation if I can. We talked a little bit about a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. Assuming that is the most rudimentary, effective, inventory management system that could work. We're setting aside the cocktail napkins, right? And so we're going to go with the Microsoft Excel spreadsheet as sort of the minimum baseline for a certain number of servers. I think you mentioned 50 or so, right? But what would you recommend? What are the really good inventory management systems that you've encountered and that you would promote or recommend for those listening in?
As a PCI assessor, I have to begin the answer with, it depends.
Oh, you wound me.
And the reason for that, one of the things you want to do, you have to do your due diligence because every client is different. Their environments are different, whether it's Microsoft or Linux or everything's in the cloud. It's going to be whatever works for you, right? One thing I did do, and I will recommend if you're going to do a search for those different kinds of automated inventory management systems, go to your favorite search engine and type in IT asset management tools. Because if you just type in device inventory or anything like that, it's going to come up with all sorts of inventory tools so that if something disappears off your shelf, you know exactly when and who bought it and everything else.
Right.
Look up IT asset management tools, and you should find a list of websites that'll show you top 10. And then when you look at them, all of them are different. They all have pros and cons. Some of them will work with Microsoft. Some of them won't. Some of them are meant for larger and more robust environments, and some aren't. The prices can range from reasonable to very expensive. It all depends on what works best for your company.
Got it. And given that answer, by the way, that's a very thoughtful answer because unfortunately, it really does depend. It depends on your control maturity. It depends on your budget. It depends on the number of people, what's necessary in order for you to effectively manage cybersecurity risk in your environment. And I got to suspect, Todd, with that answer, you've seen the pros and the cons of each, but you've also seen organizations do it wrong and do it well, regardless of the particular type of tool that they put in place. So I think that's an important aspect to this as well. So that's a very, very thoughtful answer. I appreciate that. We talked a bit about PCI here today. And so you were mentioning, and I was trying to pay attention, I think it was 12.5.1. I know that the DSS is 321 and now it's 4.0. If someone wanted a better understanding of what the requirements are for PCI, where would you send them?
There's a number of different ways that you can go to find the answers to any kind of PCI questions that you have. One is just go to Schellman.com and click on the Learning Center, and then you can filter to payment card assessments. You will find 9 different pages worth of videos and blogs and white papers, all detailing certain parts of PCI. So you can look up specific questions and those videos explain everything, or the white papers explain everything. You can also go to the PCI portal and download the DSS, and there's a bunch of supplemental documentation there as well. They want you to have that information because they want you to be PCI compliant. Your banks all want you to be PCI compliant. Your customers want you to be PCI compliant. A hard thing there is it's written in typical compliance fashion, and sometimes you need an assessor, to help translate from PCI to English.
That's right.
And then if you do use the portal and download the DSS, one tip that I always try to let people know about is if you're reading that DSS and your standard and you see a control you're not sure about, refer to the prioritized approach, because it's going to tell you what the intent of the control is. So it can give you a little bit of perspective
Interesting.
as to what they're trying to say above. Now, mind you, there's still a lot of things that we have deep discussions about. So there's still some aspects that may be a little hard to understand and nail down based on your situation, and that's where we come in. The easiest solution that I believe is that just reach out to us here at Schellman and we'll help answer any questions that you might have. And we'd love the chance to earn your business to do the PCI assessment down the road as well.
Todd, fantastic. So how would you really just give us a quick summary, any final thoughts for this discussion about inventory management?
The big thing there, Ryan, is we just want to bring everyone's attention to how important keeping an accurate inventory is. It sounds simple on the surface, but when you look beyond the surface, there's a lot of stuff going on underneath. There's look at it, keeping an inventory kind of like an iceberg. On the surface, it looks like a plain old list of stuff. But underneath, there are so many things that impact that simple list of devices in your environment that need to be added and thought about as well. So it helps with your planning. It can save you money. It can save you possibly suffering a breach. There's a ton of advantages to keeping it that way. And it makes your assessments go so much smoother. That's
right.
I can't tell you how important I think it is. And every assessment that I've ever done with a great inventory, the assessment flies right along.
Fantastic.
They don't have to do any resampling. They don't have to go back and ask for more. Their teams can just get to work right away, and it gives them the most amount of time to provide the evidence. So
that's right, Todd. Absolutely. And so really what I'm hearing you say is compliance is one thing, but it's truly about risk management and making sure that you have safeguarded your assets and have managed your responsibilities to your customers and to their data appropriately. And so an inventory management system should be top of mind on both of those regards. So I really appreciate what it is that you shared with us today. Thanks so much. That'll do it for today's installment of the Truth Series, where we strive to provide simple answers to complex questions. If you have any additional questions about anything that you heard today, inventory management systems, some important strategies and things to consider, or PCI compliance, reach out to us.